So please join me in welcoming Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, but much more importantly, friend, comrade, fellow traveler, co-conspirator, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor.
Thank you, Gio. Thanks everybody for coming out. This is I think the third talk that I've done since the book has sort of trickled out. I think it has an official publication date of sometime in February, but I did an event in Baltimore a couple of weeks ago and walked in and there was a stack of these books there. This is the first time I'd seen it. I was in Santa Fe last week giving a talk about the book, and there was a stack there. And as you see here, there's a stack there. I did a big meeting in New York last night, and you know, all to say that I'm very happy that the book is out. Really, I wrote, I think a lot of the questions that Gio raised are questions that were pertinent to me when I was writing this book. And I think in the end, I wrote the book that I wanted to read about the movement, to try to understand where it came from, why it came about at this particular time. It was very early on in the process. Haymarket Books actually approached me about writing the book last year, December 13th. I got an email at 7:30 in the morning on a Sunday that had subject line, "Great book title," and I opened the email and it said, "From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation." And I wrote back, "Yes, good book title." And the person who sent it wrote back to me, "Do you want to write it?" And I said no. I said no a couple of times. But then there's this question about why now in particular, I thought was really important to take on. So what I'm going to do tonight is to engage with at least some of the questions that were important to me in writing the book, and then to kind of wrap up the talk, I want to read some from the last chapter of the book, which really gets into this idea of what is meant by Black liberation, and also what is the process by which we can begin to actually talk about achieving not just liberation for Black people, but I think a popular saying and the movement has been that when Black people get free, everyone gets free, which I think is true. But there's a gap between where we are today and how we actually achieve that. So three questions, or three questions in particular that I want to try to engage with tonight, just to give people some sense of what the book is about. This is a 300-page book, so I don't want to try to cover everything that is in the book, but some of the more important questions, I think, one has to do with if we understand, or maybe we don't understand, but I understand racism as a permanent feature of American society, meaning quite simply that there is no period of time in this nation's history where racism and racial inequality was not actively present, then what holds back the development of movements against racism? Then why don't we also see a period of an overarching sort of unbroken string of movements against racism in the United States? Which isn't to say that when social movements aren't in formation or don't present themselves, that people are not fighting racism. It isn't to say that at all, but there is something different about the emergence of a collective movement. Even if it's disparate, even if it has different manifestations, even if it's not a cohesive and in some ways coherent movement, is much different from the kind of individual efforts that people undertake every day to challenge racial inequality in this country. And so what holds that back? That's one of the questions I want to think about tonight. Secondly, of all the times in recent history for an anti-racist movement to emerge, why now, during the tenure of the nation's first Black president? We are living through an era of unprecedented Black political power, from the Black president to the Black attorney general, to more Black people elected to Congress than at any other point in the country's history. So why is this movement happening? Why is this movement happening now? And then finally, this is a kind of series of interconnected and related questions. What does the persistence of police violence and racism over time tell us about the nature of American society? Can Black people be free under capitalism? Can Black people get free alone? And if not, how can we build a multiracial movement that not only confronts police terrorism, but that also challenges the basic logics of this society? Can we broaden the relatively narrow fight against police violence into a much broader struggle for Black liberation? And so I want to engage with these questions in different ways and let that be a sort of launching point for a more general discussion afterwards. And so to begin with, why are these movements episodic or periodic? In some ways, it's a very complicated question because it has to do with issues of consciousness and why people are willing to fight in one set of circumstances and not another. And again, I should clarify that I'm talking about the emergence of collective movements. So in trying to understand what holds back the development of anti-racist movements, I think one of the issues that I try to look at in the book is really the effect and the impact of the United States' central ideology, its creed. And what I mean by that are the ideas that are bound up in the notion of American exceptionalism and the concept of the American dream, and how both of these together work to promote, really, the mistaken belief that the United States is a land of unfettered social mobility and opportunity. And I think it's important to know that this is not, or to understand that this is not a benign ideology, but that it works actively to explain away inequality in this country as a function of personal deficit or as an individual problem having nothing to do with the system itself. And the way that it works essentially is that if this is the land of unfettered opportunity, and then all you have to do is work hard to succeed in this country, then the absence of success or the lack of success conversely means that you didn't work hard and that you are responsible for the condition that you are living with. And so in this way, the perfect corollary to the American dream and American exceptionalism is a quote unquote what is referred to as the culture of poverty or the absence of personal responsibility and other ideas like that that blame the very victims of the system for their own predicament. And this tendency towards blaming individuals does not only come from above, but when not challenged, it also becomes a way that those who are oppressed and exploited begin to make sense of their own condition. So most times, many African Americans accept that there is something wrong with Black people as a way of understanding the problems experienced in Black neighborhoods. This rhetoric gets Black people and others to look inward at their own families, their neighborhoods, their neighbors, as an explanation of Black inequality, as opposed to looking outward at structures and institutions that have nothing to do with Black families. And so part of what I'm saying is that that pressure that is exerted on African Americans, that comes from elected officials, it comes from the mass media, it's reinforced in academic institutions, it's part of popular culture to look inward for explanations of disparity between Blacks and the rest of society is not an accident, but is actively used to deflect attention away from the systemic roots of inequality in this country. But at the same time, I think it's important to say that those ideas, reactionary ideas, both from outside of the Black, of African American communities, but also within, are not static, but are quite fluid. And a whirlwind of ideas, these ideas can be set in motion when people's life experience crashes into or comes into conflict with these sorts of official narratives. For example, when people are told that you are poor because you don't work hard, and these are the same people who are getting up every day either to go to perform jobs in low-wage, back-breaking labor, or even just being poor in the United States, and understanding how difficult it is to actually be poor, and the hard work that goes into being poor and figuring out how to survive day to day, comes into direct conflict with being told that you're lazy or shiftless, or that is an explanation for the conditions that you are living in. And so when people move into activism and come into conflict with these sorts of ideas, not only does that have the potential to obliterate existing ideas, but it can also create another set of explanations for what is actually happening. So for example, I look at how the eruption of the civil rights movement and then the Black insurgency, the Black Power era of the late 1960s, not only challenged the idea that Black suffering and inequality were a product of Black family structure, but that the movements actually created counter-narratives for understanding racism and inequality. For example, Black radical Stokely Carmichael and social scientist Charles Hamilton coined the term institutional racism in 1967 to describe the systemic aspect of Black oppression, in direct opposition to the notion that Black inequality was somehow rooted in Black people or Black families. And so when a movement does break out into the open, it shatters the isolation that most people live in and shows the connection between people's different experiences and oppression. It can also imbue confidence in their collective power as it exposes the systemic roots of the problem. If we think about the impact of the Ferguson protests, we can see this. The collective resistance has helped to not only expose police violence, but to also show that police violence was not just a case of individual or rogue cops, but that it was much more profoundly deeper than that. The collective resistance of ordinary people in Ferguson also helped to expose the tyranny of the state, which further showed the systemic roots of police violence. People will remember the tanks in the streets, tear gas, the hyper-militarized reaction of the police in Ferguson against the unarmed population in that town. And so all of that is to emphasize that the movement, the collective resistance of ordinary people, has the power to expose the typical lies that are told about working class people, particularly working class and poor Black people. It has the ability to create deeper understanding of our oppression, and most importantly, it gives us the best opportunity to challenge the status quo, to challenge the typical understanding of where that oppression, where that inequality really comes from. So the second question about why now, I think is important, for me at least, was important in understanding the emergence of the movement in this particular moment, as opposed to any other period in the last 15 years, particularly under the presidency of George W. Bush. Like, why not then? Why now? I think in the days right after, the days and weeks and months right after Barack Obama's election as the nation's first Black president, the New York Times, among many other publications, ran a serious article that questioned whether or not the election meant the end of Black politics. The idea was not that African Americans would no longer be involved in politics, but the assumption was that it would no longer be necessary for a separate and particular politics attuned to the oppression of Black people. This, of course, dovetailed with the idea that the United States was entering into a post-racial period. While most African Americans did not buy that the country was moving beyond race, among almost all Americans, there was widespread optimism that Obama's victory indicated that the country was shedding its long history of racial injustice. How ironic, then, during the twilight of Obama's presidency, we have witnessed the birth of a Black social movement and the revival of radical Black politics. The movement is known by its most popular slogan, Black Lives Matter. It is diffuse, angry, and has emerged in response to the continued plague of police murder, corruption, and violence throughout Black America. Black Lives Matter is not incidental to the Obama presidency, but in many ways it is a product of it. On the eve of Obama's first inauguration, 69% of Black people said that King's dream had been fulfilled. There were high expectations from Black people that there would be a break with the politics of the past and that actual change was on the way. Obama's candidacy for president in 2007 did not begin with such high expectations. Black voters were skeptical about Obama's viability as a candidate and his absence of civil rights credentials. Black voters put their chips on Hillary Clinton instead as a sure bet. Obama then transformed his candidacy from the usual affair into something he and his supporters would describe as a social movement. Obama tapped into the anger and exhaustion of ordinary Americans who were fed up with what seemed like endless war in the Middle East, who were fed up with the complete incompetence of the federal government in reaction to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and the overall cynical nature of American politics with its idiotic sound bites and third-grade level discourse, as we are all seeing all over again in this most recent electoral contest. People may recall the soaring rhetoric of candidate Obama and how he broke decisively with the status quo in American politics. Obama declared that we, ordinary people, were, quote, the change that we had been waiting for. Recall his impassioned pleas of yes, we can. But for Black voters in particular, Obama's campaign represented even more than that. Not only because he was Black, and we shouldn't discount that in a racist country built on slave labor, but also because of what the Bush administration had represented. From the theft of the election in Florida in 2000, based on disenfranchising Black voters, to once again the shocking incompetence of the federal government in response to Hurricane Katrina. Black voters turned out for Obama like never before. Young Black voters produced the highest proportional voter turnout in the nation's history. For the first time, a higher percentage of eligible Black voters supplanted the white electorate. But almost as quickly as Obama became president, so too did the disillusionment with his limitations. It was not all at once, but there were three significant markers for African Americans that pointed to continuity with the past and not the change that had been promised. The first factor was Obama's benign response to the economic crisis in Black communities. as most will know that by the end of 2008, the American economy was in free fall. Black people would bear the brunt of the Great Recession and economic crisis that ensued. By the end, more than 240,000 black homeowners would lose their houses. By the fall of 2009, black unemployment had reached a high of 15%, fueled by cuts to federal and state government jobs that had always been the bedrock for black employment. Walmart would become the largest employer of black Americans, supplanting the historic role of work in the U.S. Postal Service. The net worth of black families fell to $11,000 compared to $141,000 for whites. And a whopping 40% of black families had zero or negative wealth. Black child poverty reached 40% in 2012, and the list could go on and on and on. It appeared that a black president was right on time. Who better to understand how racial discrimination and inequality would create uneven access to the programs intended to accelerate the economic recovery? And who better would understand that particular, or even, yes, special provisions would have to be made to pull black people out of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression? But Obama preached that he was not the president of black America, quote unquote, and that a rising tide would lift all boats. The second factor was how the president characterized black poverty. Well, while Obama was reluctant to offer particular assistance to African Americans, he did not show nearly the same reticence when it came to invoking the stale yet highly effective stereotypes of blacks as somehow being responsible for their own predicament. It was stunning. While the entire Western world was blaming Wall Street for its reckless practices, while everyone began to turn their attention to the economic inequality of capitalism and all of the structural problems in the economy, here was Barack Obama scolding black parents for feeding their children cold fried chicken, for watching television instead of reading books, and indeed lectured black America that there were, quote, no excuses for any predicament they might find themselves in. Without question, some, if not many, black people agreed with the criticism of the black poor and the black working class. It fit the common sense of the last 40 years that African Americans suffer these disparities because, as I said earlier, because of a lack of personal responsibility. It is an argument that has been reinforced at every level of government, in the mass media, and in our popular culture. And yet for others, it was an argument that completely contradicted their experience. Black homeowners had played by the rules, and they were cashing in on their American dream, only to be bilked by mortgage lenders and dirty banking practices which left them penniless. Black college graduates who had played by the rules were still 3 times as likely to be unemployed as their white counterparts. Black men with no criminal record and looking for work were still as likely to be called back as white men with a criminal record. Discrimination and other objective factors that had nothing to do with the morality or responsibility of black people were the culprits behind black poverty. And this, again, was affirmed by the explosion of the Occupy movement in the fall of 2011. Occupy forced the growing problems of poverty and inequality into the center of American politics by popularizing the slogan, "We are the 99%. Occupy was often described as a white movement, but polls found that 45% of African Americans expressed a positive view of Occupy, and an additional 35% said that the movement was good for the American political system. This would put many black people directly at odds with the no excuses mantra the president often repeated for black audiences. Finally, the growing excesses and brutality of the American criminal justice system, from violent policing to mass incarceration and beyond, drew attention to how much things remained the same. The moments that Obama had to affirm Black concerns with what people were referring to increasingly as the criminal injustice system went unheeded. For example, in September 2011, an international campaign was underway to save the life of wrongfully convicted Black death row inmate in Georgia, Troy Davis. Everyone from the Pope to the European Union to the governments of France and Germany, and even the former director of the FBI, campaigned to save Davis's life. The night that Davis was to be executed, hundreds of Black students from across Washington, D.C. marched and rallied at the U.S. Supreme Court and at the White House, hoping to lure Obama out of the White House to intervene in some way in order to save Davis's life. But Obama did nothing. He never even made a statement, instead opting to send his spokesperson out to the press to insist that this was a states' rights issue. For many, this had been the exact reason that he had been elected, but instead it was more of the same and none of the change that had been promised. Finally, the murder of Trayvon Martin and the subsequent acquittal of George Zimmerman marked a clear rupture for some with the Obama administration. As the slow trickle of facts concerning the death of Martin began to come to light, it was clear that he had been the victim of an extralegal killing. Meanwhile, Florida officials coddled and protected George Zimmerman from being arrested for the death of Martin. With the spirit of militant protests having been aroused the previous fall by the Troy Davis demonstrations and the explosion of the Occupy Wall Street movement, marches, demonstrations, sit-ins, and occupations had been validated. Black and white activists who had been involved in Occupy connected with new people drawn into the streets by the horror of the Martin murder. As the protests swelled, Obama was finally forced to speak publicly, but in doing so, he only spoke personally, saying that if he had a son, he might look like Trayvon. Considered poignant by the media, it failed to articulate or resonate with the growing Black anger against police misconduct in Florida and the refusal of officials to arrest Martin's killer. Eventually, Zimmerman would be arrested, tried, and ultimately acquitted as Trayvon Martin was transformed from a 17-year-old boy walking home to his father's house to a marijuana-smoking, oversized thug who was the aggressor. When the verdict was announced, Obama implored the public to respect the jury's decision, claiming, quote, "We are a nation of laws." What did this even mean when the Martin case so clearly demonstrated that we are a nation with two sets of laws, one for African Americans and one for everyone else? Everyone understood that if the tables had been turned, if Martin had violently set upon and shot and killed Zimmerman, he would have been arrested immediately and ultimately convicted. The raised expectations of Black people, especially young Black people, Black millennials, with the Obama presidency, had been dashed over and over again. In the aftermath of the Zimmerman verdict, Alicia Garza, a labor organizer in the Bay Area, created the hashtag #BlackLivesMatter. Its declarative simplicity articulated the anger of a generation, and the pieces of a movement began to take shape. Last year, just in terms of getting into the last cluster of questions I raised about Black liberation, last year was the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. This year marks the is the anniversary of the very first Civil Rights Act for African Americans. It was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And it said, quote, in part, "Citizens of every race and color, without regard to any previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude, shall have the same right in every state and territory in the United States." to full and equal benefit of laws and proceedings for the security of person and property as enjoyed by white citizens. And so when I was working on this, I found an interesting piece of trivia. Freddie Gray, the 25-year-old young black man whose neck was broken and almost completely severed in Baltimore, whose death provoked the Baltimore uprising last April, was picked up by police 150 years to the day of the end of the Civil War. And so if we think about that gap as the end of the Civil War ushering in a period of black personhood and black citizenship, and what it means for 150 years later for a young black man to be chased down by police because he made eye contact with the police, and that his punishment was a quote-unquote nickel ride in the police van that left his neck broken, his voice box allegedly crushed, his spleen severed. It says something about the distance, the gap between formal equality and actual real equality. And so I wanted to just read a couple of pages from the final chapter of the book to say something about that and to raise that as a larger question of what black liberation actually means. The distance from the end of the Civil War with the birth of black citizenship and civil rights to the state-sanctioned beating and torture of Freddie Gray constitutes the gap between formal equality before the law and the self-determination and self-possession inherent in actual freedom. The right to be free from oppression, the right to make determinations about your life free from duress, coercion, or threat of harm. Freedom in the United States has always been elusive, contingent, and fraught with contradictions and unattainable promises for almost everyone. Black people were not freed into an American dream, but into what Malcolm X described as an American nightmare of economic inequality and unchecked injustice. The full extent of this inequality was masked by racial terrorism. 100 years after emancipation, Black people dismantled the last vestiges of legal discrimination with the civil rights movement. But the excitement of the movement quickly faded as American cities combusted with Black people who were angry and disillusioned at being locked out of access to the riches of American society. Hundreds of thousands of Black people participated in the uprisings in search of resolutions to the problems of lead poisoning, rat infestation, hunger and malnutrition, underemployment, poor schools, and persisting poverty. Where liberals and radicals often converged was in the demand that Blacks should have greater control over their communities. For liberals, Black electoral politics was a sign of political maturity as the movement left the streets for the poll booth, urban governance, and community control. The problem was not, quote unquote, the system. It was exclusion from access to all that American society had to offer. Some radicals were also lured by the possibility of self-governance and community control. Indeed, it was a viable strategy given that much of Black life was controlled by white elected officials and white-led institutions. The question remained, however, could the machinery wielded in the oppression of Blacks now be retooled in the name of Black self-determination? If freedom had in one era been imagined as inclusion in the mainstream of American society, including admittance to its political and financial institutions, then the last 50 years have yielded a mixed record. Indeed, since the last gasp of the Black insurgency of the 1970s, there are many measures of Black accomplishment and achievement in a country where Black people were never intended to survive as a free people. Is there no greater symbol of a certain kind of Black accomplishment than a Black president? For those who consider mastery of American politics and Black political representation as the highest expression of inclusion in the mainstream, then we are surely in the heyday of American race relations. Yet paradoxically, at a moment when African Americans have achieved what no rational person could have imagined when the Civil War ended, we have simultaneously entered a new period of Black protest, Black radicalization, and the birth of a new Black left. No one knows what will come of this new political development, but many know the causes of its gestation. For as much success as some African Americans have achieved, 4 million Black children live in poverty. 1 million Black people are incarcerated. And I said this before, but 240,000 Black people lost their homes as a result of the foreclosure crisis, resulting in the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in Black savings. Never before in American history has a Black president presided over the misery of millions of Black people. The denial of the most basic standards for health, happiness, and basic humanity. Entertainer and activist Harry Belafonte Jr. recalled his last conversation with Martin Luther King, in which King lamented, quote, "I've come upon something that disturbs me deeply. We have fought hard and long for integration, as I believe we should have, and I know that we will win. But I've come to believe we are integrating into a burning house," close quote. The aspiration for Black liberation cannot be separated from what happens in the United States as a whole. Black life cannot be transformed while the rest of the country burns. The fires consuming the United States are stoked by the widespread alienation of low-wage and meaningless work, unaffordable rents, suffocating debt, and poverty. The essence of economic inequality is borne out in a simple fact. There are 400 billionaires in the United States and 45 million people living in poverty. These are not parallel facts, they are intersecting facts. There are 400 American billionaires because there are 45 million people living in poverty. Profit comes at the expense of the living wage. Corporate executives and capitalists in general are living the good life because so many others are living a life of hardship. The struggle for Black liberation, then, is not an abstract idea molded in isolation from the wider phenomenon of economic exploitation and inequality that pervades all of American society. It is intimately bound up with them. The struggle for Black liberation requires going beyond the standard narrative that Black people have come a long way, but have a long way to go, which of course says nothing about where it is that we are actually trying to get to. It requires understanding the origins and nature of Black oppression and racism more generally. Most importantly, it requires a strategy and some sense of how we get from the current situation to the future. Perhaps at its most basic level, Black liberation implies a world where Black people can live in peace without the constant threat of the social, economic, and political woes of a society that place almost no value on the vast majority of Black lives. It would mean living in a world where Black lives matter. While it is true that Black people can get free, while it is true that when Black people get free, everyone gets free, Black people in America cannot get free alone. In that sense, Black liberation is bound up with the project of human liberation and social transformation. Thank you.